Tonight's headline centers on Buckingham Palace, where the spotlight has shifted away from tradition and ceremony, and instead onto a confrontation that insiders describe as one of the most unexpected twists in recent royal history. The focus: Queen Camilla, shaken to her core, and Carole Middleton, the mother of the Princess of Wales, whose quiet resilience and calculated response have altered the balance of power inside the House of Windsor. It began with a statement that, to some, seemed blunt and dismissive. According to palace sources, Queen Camilla told Princess Catherine to stop bringing her parents and siblings to family gatherings, claiming they were too ordinary and a source of embarrassment for the royal institution. The remark was not just a personal slight. It set the tone for years of tension between two women representing two very different worlds, one born into the traditions of the aristocracy, the other who had built her family's place through decades of work and determination. Reports say Catherine was visibly unsettled when her parents were asked to enter royal events through a back entrance. Insiders add that the Princess of Wales struggled privately to convey to her family the strain of Camilla's quiet but firm instructions. Behind palace gates, such moments may seem minor, but for those who understand the language of power in royal circles, every gesture and every exclusion carries symbolic weight. Then came Carole Middleton's own voice in the public sphere. In a rare interview reflecting on the collapse of her company, Party Pieces, she revealed, without naming names, that during those most difficult months, she felt her family was not only ignored, but deliberately diminished. The revelation cast new light on how the Princess of Wales's mother endured both financial loss and what she described as thinly veiled contempt from figures inside the palace. Observers described it as a glimpse into a parallel monarchy, the image presented to the world and the reality lived by those who orbit it. Carole Middleton, often portrayed as a supportive parent in the background, was suddenly reframed as a woman navigating a storm. For more than a decade, she had carried herself with discretion, smiling at weddings, attending baptisms, and watching from the sidelines. But privately, as friends later disclosed, she felt the sting of being treated as an outsider, welcomed when convenient, disregarded when the doors closed. The contrast could not have been clearer. On one side stood Queen Camilla, long embedded in the social codes of Britain's upper class. On the other was Carole, a former flight attendant who, alongside her husband Michael, built a thriving family business from their kitchen table. Their success afforded their children elite education and a pathway to the very heart of the monarchy. Yet, that very success became the source of quiet judgment. Royal insiders whispered that she was regarded as a tradeswoman, someone who, despite her daughter's marriage to the future king, was never truly considered part of the circle. The first open sign of this divide came in 2011 at the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton. For the global audience, the day was a seamless union between two families. Photographs showed Carole and Camilla standing side by side, smiling politely for the official portraits. Yet behind the formalities, royal watchers detected something different. A frost, subtle, but unmistakable. Carole's background was miles apart from the aristocratic lineage of Camilla Shand. She had built her standing, not inherited it. For every achievement, she relied on effort and persistence. But among those born into centuries-old privilege, such credentials were viewed with suspicion. One acquaintance described the atmosphere at royal gatherings bluntly. She would be in the room, but some simply looked through her. The message was clear. You may be the mother of the future queen, but you are not one of us. This message hardened in the months leading to the wedding. Carole, accustomed to planning details with precision, naturally wished to contribute touches of her own: flowers, seating arrangements, even additions to the guest list. Each proposal was rejected by the palace committee, politely but firmly. The reasoning, officials said, was tradition and protocol. But for Carole, it was a reminder that this was not her daughter's private celebration. It was a state occasion where her presence, though visible, carried little weight. After the wedding, the atmosphere did not improve. The Princess of Wales took on her royal responsibilities with grace, and Catherine's confidence grew. Yet her mother faced the reality that her role would remain confined. Christmas, once a cherished Middleton tradition, was now dictated by Sandringham Protocol. Even opportunities to see her grandchildren were filtered through layers of schedules and staff. These were not moments of open hostility. Instead, they were the quiet mechanisms of exclusion, rules invoked, customs cited, access restricted. For Carole Middleton, the experience was one of watching her daughter succeed in a world that seemed determined to keep her, and by extension her family, at arm's length. As one palace observer put it, the tension was not personal animosity, it was about class, culture, and power. And at its centre stood two matriarchs, each embodying a different story of Britain. One born to it, one who built her way into it. Their collision was inevitable, and as history would show, it would not remain hidden for long. The birth of Prince George in July 2013 should have marked a season of joy for the Middleton family. For Carole, it was a moment to embrace the role of grandmother with the warmth and experience of someone who had raised 3 children of her own. But within palace walls, joy was swiftly tempered by protocol. The heir to the throne, even as an infant, was subject to structures designed not just to protect, but to define. A royal nanny was chosen through official channels, strict routines were drawn up, access was regulated. What might appear as practical steps to maintain order were, in Carole's eyes, yet another mechanism to keep her at a distance. Friends close to her recall her frustration, not in loud complaints but in quiet sadness. Offers to help were declined. Visits to Kensington Palace required layers of scheduling. The grandmother, eager to support, often felt reduced to the role of a guest. Observers note that Queen Camilla's influence was evident in this approach. As a grandmother herself, she was said to favour the royal system over family informality. One former courtier later revealed, "She believed the royal children should be raised within the framework of tradition from the very beginning." She felt the Middleton style, warm, casual, and middle class, was not suited to shaping a future monarch. The contrast was stark. Camilla's grandchildren, from her first marriage, were welcomed into royal life with ease. Their presence at events, their contact with the Queen consort, was natural and unguarded. For Carole, the difference was painful. She watched another grandmother embraced, while she herself stood at a distance, her access controlled by security protocols and unwritten hierarchies. The divide grew more visible in 2015, at the baptism of Princess Charlotte. The ceremony, steeped in royal history, took place at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham, the same church where Diana, Princess of Wales, had once been baptized. Carole had planned a small private gathering afterward, an intimate reception for close family and friends. But at the last moment, her plan was altered. Sources say staff linked to the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall intervened, citing security and logistics. What Carole envisioned as a family celebration was absorbed into a larger, more formal event at Sandringham House. The private became public. The personal was consumed by protocol. Behind her measured composure, disappointment lingered. Friends later revealed that Carole felt stripped of even small gestures of closeness. She maintained her silence in public, adhering to the very discretion she had instilled in her children. But the comparisons gnawed at her. While Camilla's relatives enjoyed an ease of contact, Carole was repeatedly reminded of her position on the margins. Through these years, Catherine bore the strain of trying to balance both worlds. She remained committed to her royal role, carrying out duties with calm assurance, yet she could see the toll it took on her mother. The distance, the exclusions, the constant reminders that the Middletons were visitors, not participants, it was a burden that pressed quietly but heavily on both women. And then, in November 2018, the situation shifted. The occasion was a grand one, the 70th birthday celebration of Prince Charles, held at Buckingham Palace with royals and dignitaries gathered from across Europe. the Middletons attended, presenting the same serene image as always. But beneath the chandeliers, in a quiet corner of conversation, a remark was made that cut deep. According to accounts later shared, Camilla, speaking among longtime friends, drew a distinction between old money and new money. Heritage, she said, outweighed mere financial success. No names were mentioned, but the meaning was unmistakable. For Carole Middleton, who had spent a lifetime building her family's future through hard work, the words were a direct dismissal of everything she represented. That night, humiliation transformed into resolve. Those close to her describe a shift, not of anger, but of clarity. Carole realized that no matter how well she behaved, no matter how gracefully she supported her daughter, she would never be accepted on equal terms. To the old guard, she would always remain an outsider. It was in that moment, friends say, that she decided to change her approach. She would no longer try to fit into the mold the palace set for her. Instead, she would create her own strategy, quiet, deliberate, and meticulous. From late 2011 onward, Carole Middleton began keeping detailed notes. Every cancelled visit, every last-minute disruption to family plans, every instance where her presence was diminished or redirected, she recorded them with precision. But she went further. Drawing on the business network she had cultivated over decades, she began to collect information. She reached out discreetly to contacts in finance, property, and law. She listened, she gathered, she filed. Piece by piece, she assembled a picture not just of exclusion, but of how power and money were being managed within the institution that had sidelined her. Individually, the details may have seemed small: renovations charged to official accounts, sudden changes in suppliers, subtle shifts in charitable funding. But together, the fragments formed a portrait of questionable practices and concealed influence. What began as a grandmother's quiet frustration was transforming into something much larger. Carole Middleton was no longer simply a supportive mother watching from the wings. She was building a record, a portfolio that, if ever revealed, could alter the balance within the palace itself. The stage was set. Years of polite invisibility were giving way to a new, calculated presence. And as events would soon show, the consequences would be felt at the very heart of the monarchy. By the close of 2018, the relationship between Carole Middleton and the palace had shifted from quiet tolerance to something far more calculated. What began as years of silent exclusion had now evolved into a private campaign of documentation and discovery. Insiders described this as the moment the balance of patience tipped into strategy. Carole Middleton was no longer trying to win acceptance. She was preparing a record. Her notebooks, kept meticulously from late 2018 onward, became the core of what would later be called her portfolio. Each entry was marked with dates, times, and specific details. Cancelled family gatherings, abruptly changed holiday plans, invitations withdrawn or redirected, school events where her grandchildren performed only for her seat to be quietly reassigned. The documentation was precise, the tone clinical. This was not emotion, this was evidence. But the significance of her effort went beyond personal grievances. Using her long-established network in business and society, Carole began to access information few expected her to seek. Contacts in finance disclosed details about renovations funded through sovereign grants. Friends in property management whispered about overlapping interests between palace courtiers and outside contractors. Even trusted figures in charitable organizations quietly admitted to shifts in funding that appeared to favor projects aligned with the Queen Consort's circle, often at the expense of those linked to the Prince and Princess of Wales. The fragments alone were hardly explosive. A supplier changed without explanation. A countryside residence redecorated under the justification of official entertaining. A charity budget suddenly redirected. But when arranged together by someone with the patience and discipline of Carole Middleton, they formed a map, a picture of influence, priorities, and concealed transactions. According to those who later reviewed portions of her material, the portrait was troubling. It suggested not illegality but opacity, a blurred line between official responsibility and personal preference. It highlighted a pattern. As Catherine and William's public influence grew, their family's private access seemed deliberately narrowed, while Camilla's orbit expanded both socially and financially. For years, such dynamics might have remained invisible to the public. But Carole Middleton, by compiling her portfolio, ensured they would not remain invisible within the palace. By early 2024, signs of tension could no longer be disguised. At a school performance for Prince Louis, witnesses noted that Carole and Queen Camilla stood on opposite sides of the hall. The two women, once photographed side by side at weddings and christenings, now appeared unwilling to share even casual space. Observers described Prince William moving deliberately between them, playing the role of buffer. His efforts, however calm, only underscored the visible divide. What had been a private Cold War was seeping into public view. Royal watchers pointed out the absence of customary smiles, the stiffness of body language, the quiet but noticeable distance at family events. Inside Buckingham Palace, staff whispered of a growing chill. Two matriarchs, once balanced in their roles, were now locked in an unspoken contest of presence and influence. The moment of confrontation arrived in February 2025. The date, February 6, would later be noted as a turning point in palace dynamics. On a grey winter morning, a black car entered the gates of Buckingham Palace. There were no aides, no press photographers, no entourage. Inside sat Carole Middleton, carrying a single leather briefcase. The meeting was unusual from the outset. Queen Camilla, known for her careful scheduling and guarded approach to private audiences, agreed to see her. Palace officials assumed it would be a request for more access to grandchildren, or perhaps a plea for greater inclusion. What transpired was entirely different. For 90 minutes, behind closed doors, Carole Middleton presented the portfolio she had compiled over years. According to two sources briefed on the session, she did not raise her voice. She was measured, calm, deliberate. She opened the briefcase, laid the documents across a polished table, and explained what they represented: a pattern of financial irregularities, a timeline of decisions disadvantaging her daughter's family, and a clear record that these were not coincidences but part of an organized system of exclusion. Among the papers were notes on sensitive royal trusts, unexplained travel expenses, and renovations billed to official funds. More striking, there was a chronology linking these financial maneuvers to the systematic marginalization of the Middleton family. The implication was not one of scandal for scandal's sake. It was that the personal exclusion she experienced was mirrored by institutional maneuvers with tangible consequences. The most devastating detail, according to those who later heard whispers of the contents, concerned records of private meetings in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. The documents suggested high-level financial discussions involving figures close to the royal household. Nothing directly unlawful was cited, but the secrecy and the foreign settings painted a picture that, if revealed publicly, would be damaging to the monarchy's reputation. Carole Middleton's message was quiet but unmistakable. She was not seeking a concession. She was not pleading for recognition. She was making it clear that she had observed, recorded, and could not be dismissed. She was no longer outside the table of power. She was at it, whether or not the palace chose to acknowledge her. Reports from staff who entered the room afterward describe Queen Camilla as visibly shaken. Known for her composure, she appeared pale, distraught, and uncharacteristically unsettled. Some accounts even suggest she was seen in tears after reviewing sections of the documents. For a monarch who prided herself on steadiness, it was an extraordinary moment. Carole Middleton left as quietly as she had arrived. No statements, no leaks, no public gesture. The briefcase returned with her, its contents intact. But inside Buckingham Palace, silence thundered. The unspoken rules had been broken. A woman once considered peripheral had demonstrated that she possessed information capable of shifting the ground beneath the institution itself. The tipping point had been reached. The palace could no longer treat her as invisible. The quiet war was over. A new phase, more uncertain, more fragile, was beginning. The meeting of February 6, 2025, was not merely a private exchange between two women. It was a reckoning, and its consequences began to unfold almost immediately within the walls of Buckingham Palace. Hours after Carole Middleton's quiet departure, schedules shifted without explanation. Meetings at Buckingham Palace and Clarence House were abruptly cancelled. Staff, who had long been retired, were discreetly called back into service. For observers who know how carefully palace life is managed, the sudden disruption was unmistakable. Something had shaken the system at its core. Within days, Queen Camilla withdrew from public view. For nearly 10 days, she was absent from official duties, her absence explained as scheduling adjustments. Yet insiders confirm she was grappling with the shock of Carole's presentation. One palace assistant later described the Queen as shaken in a way we had never seen before, hesitant, subdued, almost uncertain. When Camilla finally reappeared on March 11th, attending the Commonwealth Day ceremony at Westminster Abbey, her demeanour was noticeably altered. Analysts of royal body language pointed to her posture. Less upright, more cautious, her usual confidence softened. Conversations with dignitaries were shorter, her presence less commanding. For a queen consort who had built her image on resilience and composure, the change was stark. Inside the palace, staff were divided. On one side stood those loyal to Camilla and the traditionalist court. For them, Carole's actions represented a breach of unspoken rules, an outsider challenging centuries of hierarchy. On the other side, particularly among younger staff and those aligned with the Prince and Princess of Wales, there was quiet vindication. As one aide reportedly remarked, "Someone finally stood up to the old guard." The mood was not celebratory. It was tense, cautious, uncertain. A long-standing balance had been disrupted, and the repercussions were still being measured. Prince William found himself at the centre of this storm. Known for his calm demeanour, he understood the depth of what had occurred. Those close to him describe his reaction as deeply conflicted, troubled by the confrontation but sympathetic to his mother-in-law's position. In the weeks that followed, William was seen holding private meetings with senior advisors, some of whom had once served his late mother, Princess Diana. The symbolism was not lost on royal watchers. Diana, too, had struggled against the palace machinery. This time, however, the next generation was not alone. The press, though unaware of the full details, sensed turbulence. Journalists pointed to unexplained cancellations in the royal calendar, noted the visible frostiness between the Waleses and Queen Camilla, and speculated about internal divisions. Businesses with royal warrants began quietly reassessing their connections, wary of being drawn into whatever storm might follow. Carole Middleton, meanwhile, remained silent. She returned to her home in Berkshire, running her affairs and spending time with her family as if nothing had changed. No interviews, no public remarks. Her silence was its own message. She had shown she held the cards. She did not need to play them publicly. That silence proved powerful. In a monarchy where control of narrative is everything, the uncertainty was destabilizing. What did Carole have? How much was she prepared to reveal? Could the details, if ever exposed, trigger a crisis of trust in the institution? None of those questions had answers, and the lack of clarity was more dangerous than any open declaration. For Queen Camilla, the impact was personal and visible, where once she had moved with confidence as the senior matriarch of the royal household, she now appeared tentative. Her role had not changed formally, but her authority no longer felt unchallenged. The confrontation with Carole had left a mark, not in headlines, but in the atmosphere of the court. Observers described this period as one of unusual silence inside Buckingham Palace. Staff avoided speculation, conversations became clipped, and loyalties were tested. It was a rare moment when the monarchy, usually defined by continuity, projected uncertainty. For the public, the changes were subtle but noticeable. Queen Camilla, long regarded as steady and composed, seemed more reserved. The Princess of Wales, on the other hand, began to step forward more visibly, her presence at events carrying greater weight. Without a word spoken, a shift was underway. What began as a quiet meeting behind closed doors had unleashed ripples across the palace. The confrontation had ended, but its fallout was only beginning. The days following Carole Middleton's decisive meeting with Queen Camilla were described by insiders as some of the most unsettled the palace had experienced in decades. For an institution built on continuity and ritual, disruption is rare. Yet in February and March 2025, disruption became the defining feature of royal life. Almost immediately, the ripple effects were visible. Long-standing palace schedules were thrown into disarray. High-level meetings that had been planned months in advance were abruptly cancelled. In some cases, invitations sent to foreign dignitaries were quietly withdrawn. For observers who measure the rhythm of royal life, such sudden shifts were telling. Something serious had unsettled the core. Within the palace walls, the response was frantic but discreet. Retired advisors, figures once considered relics of previous reigns, were summoned back into service. Their return signaled the depth of concern. When an institution turns to the past to stabilize the present, it reveals just how fragile the present has become. At the same time, Queen Camilla's absence from the public eye fueled speculation. For nearly 10 days, she was unseen at official functions. Official statements attributed this to minor scheduling changes, but the explanations rang hollow. Behind the scenes, sources describe a queen visibly shaken by the documents Carole Middleton had laid before her. One aide who entered her office days after the meeting recalled her as pale, quiet, and unlike herself. Another noted moments of visible distress, an extraordinary departure from her usual composure. When Camilla finally re-emerged on March 11th at Westminster Abbey for the Commonwealth Day service, the contrast was clear. Observers noted a queen consort diminished. Her movements were slower, her greetings shorter, her presence less commanding. Analysts pointed to her reliance on King Charles, standing closer than usual, her body angled toward him in subtle dependence. The woman once seen as unshakable now appeared careful, even uncertain. The palace staff, meanwhile, were divided. Among traditionalists, Carole's intervention was seen as an act of defiance, an outsider daring to challenge the unwritten codes that governed royal life. But among younger staff, and those aligned with the Prince and Princess of Wales, her actions carried a different meaning. They interpreted it as a long overdue correction, a sign that the quiet frustrations of the past had finally been voiced. As one junior aide confided anonymously, it felt as if someone had finally spoken the truth everyone else was too afraid to say. The division was more than symbolic. In private offices, loyalties hardened. Those who had long supported Camilla and her circle closed ranks, suspicious of leaks and wary of newcomers. Others shifted closer to William and Catherine, sensing that the balance of influence was changing. The palace, known for its rigid unity, began to resemble a house with cracks running through its walls. Prince William was drawn directly into the center of this turbulence. His calm and measured demeanor was tested as he balanced competing obligations: loyalty to the institution, compassion for his mother-in-law, and concern for the stability of the monarchy. Insiders describe his mood in those weeks as deeply conflicted, yet he also recognized the significance of what had occurred. In a telling development, William held a series of private meetings with advisors once associated with his late mother, Princess Diana. These sessions, reported quietly in palace circles, carried symbolic weight. Diana, too, had faced the isolating power of palace structures. For William, seeking guidance from those who had stood with her was a statement in itself. The lessons of the past were informing his decisions for the future. The media, while lacking direct access to the confrontation's details, began to detect the outlines of a story. Journalists noted unexplained cancellations in the royal diary. They observed the visible frostiness between Queen Camilla and the Wales family during public events. Commentators wrote of unseen tensions and shifts within the royal dynamic. Businesses holding royal warrants, sensitive to any sign of instability, began reassessing their affiliations, careful not to be caught in potential fallout. Through it all, Carole Middleton remained silent. Her return to Berkshire was uneventful. She resumed her daily life, spending time with family, overseeing her affairs, and avoiding all public comment. That silence carried its own weight. In a system obsessed with narrative control, Carole had created uncertainty without uttering a single word. The palace could not predict her next move, and that unpredictability was itself destabilizing. Royal watchers noted the irony. For years, Carole had been dismissed as peripheral, visible in photographs but invisible in influence. Now, by speaking only once and retreating into silence, she had become the unseen force haunting palace corridors. As one commentator observed, she did not fire a public shot, but she proved she had the ammunition. That was enough. For Queen Camilla, the aftermath was especially difficult. Once confident in her role as senior matriarch, she now moved more cautiously. Her authority remained intact on paper, but in practice, it felt diminished. The confrontation had not removed her from power, but it had altered her standing. She was no longer untouchable. The House of Windsor, for all its resilience, thrives on predictability. And in early 2025, predictability vanished. The monarchy had been reminded, by a woman long underestimated, that power is not only inherited, it can also be earned, documented, and quietly wielded. What remained unclear was how the institution would adapt. Could the fractures be healed? Would Queen Camilla reassert her authority, or had her confidence been irreparably shaken? And how would Catherine, the Princess of Wales, step into the space that had quietly opened before her? The confrontation was over, but the transformation had only just begun. By spring 2025, the storm triggered by Carole Middleton's confrontation with Queen Camilla had settled into a new reality. The monarchy, though outwardly unchanged, was no longer the same, and at its centre stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose quiet ascent began to reshape the institution from within. Observers had long noted Catherine's careful approach. From the day she entered royal life, she avoided open conflict. She studied precedent, mirrored the discipline of Queen Elizabeth II, and built her image on steadiness. Unlike her mother, she did not confront directly. Instead, she absorbed, adapted, and waited for her moment. That moment arrived after February 2025. With Queen Camilla subdued and the palace fractured, Catherine stepped forward, not with grand statements, but with small, deliberate acts that carried unmistakable weight. Her public schedule expanded subtly. Additional visits were announced, engagements framed around families, children, and cost of living challenges. These were not random choices. Each appearance emphasized relatability, responsibility, and empathy, qualities that resonated deeply with a public-facing economic strain. Catherine began recycling outfits more frequently, mixing designer pieces with affordable brands. The gesture, modest in practice, was powerful in symbolism. It told the public she understood their struggles, aligning the monarchy with their reality rather than distancing it. Behind palace walls, shifts were even more significant. William and Catherine's office, once housed in a peripheral section of Kensington Palace, was relocated to a prime suite of rooms inside Buckingham Palace itself, just steps from King Charles's own quarters. To insiders, the geography said everything. In royal life, proximity equals power. And the Waleses were no longer the future waiting in line. They were the present, embedded in the very heart of decision-making. Staff noted a change in atmosphere. Where once Catherine's voice in planning meetings had been one among many, it now carried weight. She asked questions, guided priorities, and shaped messaging. Her approach was not forceful but strategic, calm, consistent, impossible to ignore. As one advisor remarked, "She doesn't need to raise her voice, the room leans in when she speaks." The transformation was visible at Easter 2025. During the family's public walk to St. George's Chapel, Queen Camilla appeared subdued, her steps careful, her presence quieter than usual. Catherine, by contrast, projected confidence. Photographs captured her poised demeanor, her interactions natural, her authority unspoken but undeniable. For royal watchers, the symbolism was striking. The matriarchal center of gravity had shifted. This rise was not Catherine's alone. It was inseparable from her mother's earlier stand. Carole Middleton's portfolio had not destroyed the monarchy. It had exposed its vulnerabilities. In doing so, it created space for Catherine to step forward, not as a challenger, but as a stabilizer. Where her mother had drawn the line, Catherine extended the influence. Together, their actions formed a quiet, generational strategy. One challenged exclusion, the other embodied inclusion. For King Charles, the dynamic presented both relief and complexity. On one hand, Catherine's growing authority strengthened the future of the crown. Her popularity with the public, her steady image, and her careful alignment with tradition ensured continuity. On the other hand, it created an undeniable contrast with Camilla's diminished position. The partnership at the center of his reign no longer appeared balanced. Inside the palace, staff increasingly aligned themselves with the Waleses. Younger aides gravitated toward Catherine's style, modern, empathetic, approachable. Senior figures recognized her influence and began factoring her perspective into strategic decisions. The monarchy, long resistant to rapid change, was evolving in real time. For the public, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Social media accounts linked to William and Catherine became more personal, sharing candid moments, photographs of the children, and glimpses of life behind formal events. The tone was warmer, more human. It stood in contrast to the stiffness of past decades, offering a monarchy that felt both traditional and accessible. In private, Catherine reportedly leaned on William more closely than ever, and he, in turn, relied on her judgment. Their partnership became a quiet dual monarchy in practice, with decisions increasingly made together, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. By summer 2025, the question was no longer whether the Middletons belonged. It was how far their influence would extend. Carole's determination had forced recognition. Catherine's composure was translating that recognition into authority. The monarchy had not fallen, but it had shifted. And in that shift lay the story of power passing, not through confrontation alone, but through evolution. A daughter of a former flight attendant, guided by the silent strength of her mother, now stood ready to define the next chapter of Britain's royal family. As one palace insider concluded, "Power in this house never disappears. It only changes hands. And it is changing, quietly, steadily, in plain sight."